Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the playoffs have wound down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, something for everyone every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Coming up on today's show, we take a look at the Bucks offseason. We're going to apply a grade, but there is a caveat to keep in mind for this conversation. We get into that next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined by Camille Davis, and we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube as well, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Camille, one of those interesting shows where we've kind of tiptoed around it already with some of the moves that the Bucks have made, but it has started to calm down, not only for the Bucks, for a lot of teams out there. So wanted to take a look at the offseason and I suppose apply a grade, but I mentioned there's a caveat. So here's how we're viewing this. I understand there's probably a decent amount of frustrated Bucks fans and fans that are disappointed to say, well, you didn't make any big moves. You didn't trade Brook Lopez. You didn't trade Pat Connaughton.
Right.
You didn't trade Bobby Portis. You weren't able to get off of some of that. This is the way we're viewing this is more of realistically with what the Bucks had to work with. How would you rate these moves? So it's not as simple as, well, they didn't shave any money and they didn't get off of this contract, so it's a D- for me. It's, look, did we really expect that to happen? So with that in mind, we're going to take a look at the moves that they made, the draft picks, the two signings, and I think you do have to add in the coaching moves as well, how that compares to what other teams who may have had more available to work with did. So let's just start with the two free agency moves. And to me, I think it is very much as simple as this. You're essentially swapping out Jay Crowder for Taurean Prince.
Yep.
And we think Pat Beverly for Delon Wright. To me, that right there is an upgrade on both fronts. So I view that as a positive. Again, may not be, hey, you know who your fifth starter is, or you got a bona fide guy that's on the level of being an all-star or a very, very solid player. But we talked about depth being a big issue for this team and just finding playable players in the playoffs. I do think you found that, or at least are in a better spot in those two positions than you were a year ago.
I would agree with that. And even thinking about just rating like those moves in itself, like none of the moves that the Bucks have made, I think, are like an A. Like it's nothing where you see and you're like, wow, like you really did that. Like you did your thing, Bucks. Okay. It was more so of you have limited resources. What can you do to try to improve your team at the moment? And I definitely do agree. I think Prince will be an upgrade over Jay Crowder, and Delon Wright should theoretically be an upgrade over Pat Beverly. Now, one of the things for Pat Bev that I know a lot of people were liking about what he brought to the team was that energy, that attitude, and all that other stuff that comes with his play on the court. That just comes from him being Pat Bev, just that personality type. So you do lose that aspect of it. But on the court fit, what Delon Wright does at a bit of a younger age as well should give you what Pat Bev was giving you, if not a little bit more at this stage in Pat Bev's career. Now, if this was, Houston Pat Bev that the Bucks had got, it's a different conversation. So just being realistic about where he is in his game right now, I definitely do see those two additions as upgrades. And the Bucks, as we have mentioned multiple times, still have a open roster spot. So the moves might not be done at this point. So we're taking a snapshot of things as it stands July 16th. This can change going forward, but with those free agency additions, they give the Bucks more defensive flexibility. And that was a sore spot for the Bucks last season, where you're like, we just need a little bit more defense out there on the court that we can trust at the moment. And then you bring in these two vets who have done that in their past. And then, of course, we've heard all the scuttlebutt about the Bucks looking to lean on some of those young guys to have rotation roles as well. So, yeah, I definitely do like the free agent additions that the Bucks have had. I didn't think that Bucks would be able to get Taurean Prince. I thought he'd go a little bit higher than what he went to. So those two additions, I think, did help make the team a bit better.
And that other point that you made is one that we can't just gloss over either. Is that you shaved 7 years off the collective age of the roster, with Taurean Prince being 4 years younger than Jay Crowder and Delon Wright being 3 years younger than Pat Beverly. So again, we said you need versatility. You need guys that can defend on the perimeter. You need to get younger and more athletic. And they may not have done this in one fell swoop here, but I think overall they've addressed some of these moves or some of those areas of concern. So let's just jump right to this part here, because I already saw it come up in the comments, and it was exactly what I was going to apply, and I'll talk through the logic here. But those were the two free agency moves that the Bucks made. Mm-hmm. There is potential for one more. The roster sits at 14. There's been even more smoke with one name that we've mentioned and said, you cannot discount this, guys. And that came up from a more reputable source yesterday. So we'll get to that in the next segment. But as Tim points out here, C+. A lot of moving parts with the team last year. May not be a bad thing to be at that C+ range. That's the grade that I was going to apply to the Bucks for the offseason, in that I don't think it was bad. It certainly wasn't a home run. You did about as good as you could have expected. But when you look at the Knicks bringing in Mikal Bridges, the 76ers getting a lot better. Cavaliers have been interesting too, because it's basically just been, we extended Donovan Mitchell and we made a coaching change. No changes there really for Cleveland. So I was teetering on the C+ B- range that I would give them, saying it's not a bad offseason in a vacuum with what they had to work with. But I can't put this up there and say, hey, one of the best off seasons that they could have possibly imagined.
Yeah, I would agree. B- would be the highest grade. Like, if that's the highest grade I could give the Bucks at this particular time, I was definitely leaning towards that C+ range myself. Again, we understand they had limited resources. We understand. And even I think part of what can lower that grade for others would be just all the smoke that's been around the team, all the different reports that you've been hearing about. Oh, Pat Connaughton's on the trading block, or they're looking to get off Bobby Portis, or looking to get off Brook Lopez. And then when you don't see a major move made, it can kind of feel a little like deflating of like, okay, I thought based on reports that more would be happening. But as it currently stands, all that has happened right now is Taurean Prince and Delon Wright, which, as we said, should be positive additions for this team. And if they do get that Gary Trent Jr., which I see a comment coming in from Liger about how there's no money for him anywhere. So it's either Nuggets or Bucks on a prove-it deal, which is exactly where we're kind of getting, which is also why I was so adamant about wanting to keep the Bucks 15th roster spot open. Because I saw this happen last summer with the 76ers when Kelly Oubre signed for a minimum, where you're just like, that was it? Like, that's how you were able to get Kelly Oubre? So it's no guarantee the Bucks can get Gary Trent Jr., but having that spot open with the market going the way that it has been going, with Trent weighing his options of possibly doing a one-year deal somewhere, the Bucks are on that list, or at least they're a known suitor of Gary Trent Jr. at this point as well. So yeah, you got to keep it open, and I'm cool with that. I'm happy that spot is still open at the moment.
A couple of questions coming in about that final roster spots, how the Bucks would choose to use that, if they choose to use that, I suppose. But we mentioned that most recent report on Gary Trent Jr. We'll get into that coming up in our next segment here. And also, we touched on the free agency moves, but the 2 draft picks. And to me, I understand, very polarizing. But if we want to take an optimistic approach, I think there's one thing to keep in mind with those 2 selections. So we'll get into that conversation as well coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Passion, drive, and patience. That's the formula for winning championships, and that is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit only available to U.S. customers. So I mentioned the 2 draft picks. We'll get to the Gary Trent Jr. Updates in a second here. But A.J. Johnson and Tyler Smith, going into the draft, we spent a lot of time looking at guys that we thought made sense in terms of where they were projected to slot in. And I think we spent a lot of time focusing on players that were more likely to step in and contribute immediately. And I understand there may be some disappointment there, especially when we're talking about the limited resources that the Bucks have to make this roster better. I also get Lakers fans, especially if they're going to point out, look, you think Taurean Prince is going to close for you. Good luck with that one. Look, neither of us are suggesting Taurean Prince is an all-star player or even a top-tier starter in the league. But I think our point all along has been, look, I don't think you guys realize where the Bucks were a year ago with everybody basically not named Lillard, Middleton, Giannis, and Lopez to an extent. So I think that's part of it. But with those 2 guys, it's kind of tough for me to really assess what made the most sense because of the limitations the Bucks are up against. But also, I do think we have to point out, we have seen a lot of teams get in trouble in the past, and you see it a lot more in football too, where you make a draft pick looking to plug an immediate hole versus, look, especially when we're at the back of the first round and realistically where you're drafting there, you should not be expecting. I know it's happened before, but you should not be expecting to find a guy that's going to step in and holy cow, how did the Bucks get him at 23? When you're in that spot, I still think you have to view this as who's the best guy on our board, who has the best chance, who fits all the things we're looking for organizationally. Maybe it's not this year. Maybe it's the back half of next year. But who do we think has the best chance to develop into a player that fits what we need down the road versus immediately?
And this was an interesting draft, to say none the least, with just the consensus of everybody was going into it saying, like, this is an eye of the beholder type of draft where you might be surprised at who's going in the lottery. You might be surprised who's going in the 20s because it's really based on what the team values, what their board is looking like, and how they organize things. There was not much consensus amongst teams, apparently, in this particular draft. So to your point about where the Bucks were selecting, my whole thing with the Bucks having those 2 draft picks was, do they trade one and try to get that immediate help? And as soon as they selected A.J. Johnson and then Tyler Smith and made it very clear we intend to keep both players and roster them, that was the moment for me where I was like, okay, there is a little shift happening of how the Bucks are looking to build this team in a way that we haven't seen for the last few years, where that's why we were thinking, okay, well, maybe they'll draft somebody who can come in, who's projected, to be a bit more ready to go. Maybe they'll trade this draft pick to get some more help that's ready to go now. But the Bucks decided we're going to lean in. We're going to trust our board. We think there's something special with A.J. Johnson, that he can be somebody. We think that Tyler Smith can be somebody. It probably won't be this year, but we're fine with developing them because we're cool with everybody else that we have on this roster, and we can take our time with bringing them along. And hearing that was kind of like, okay, I did not expect you guys to go that way. And again, we've talked about how this new CBA is affecting things, and it does seem like so many more teams now are really leaning into that player development piece. I saw one of the comments pop up just saying, like, it's hard to grade the draft picks, and I would agree with that. That's smart thinking. Q, very smart thinking. You can't judge the draft players at this point. Right now, we're just kind of judging the process behind it. So, like, if these players hit, and I feel like John Horst is due for some good draft picks, like we got to hit soon. But if they come through, like, you look back at this and you're like, wow, this was a really good decision for the Bucks. But the process behind it, what they're thinking of, let's get some guys we can try to develop. We have the vets, we got some new guys in free agency, and then we have the returning young guys on our roster who we think some of these guys are going to be able to help as well. Like, so let's take our time. And I do like that approach.
Yeah, and that's I don't even want to say complicated. That's the whole piece with the draft picks is it is too early to judge what you have here. It kind of talking through the logic of why you would do this and kind of plan for the future more than trying to see who can plug an immediate hole. One of the guys that we talked about too, we saw already going to miss the entire season in Delon Holmes with a torn Achilles. So I think the last piece of it was just, again, with limited resources available in the offseason, was it a miss? And we don't have this answer. We won't have this for a year or 2 years from now. But was it a miss to not package one or even both of those picks in some type of move to get off of salary? But I'm just going to go back to what we talked about already a couple of times this summer in, Brooke Lopez specifically, when we kind of pointed out realistically what's available, what have we heard pop up, what have the Bucks been linked to, and neither of us saw realistic trade proposals that were out there. Neither of us saw the move that makes you a better team. It makes you a different team. It saves you money, but for an aging team who, again, with the way salaries are structured, maybe 2 years is what you have to look at with this group, right? Probably one. I just didn't see one that would keep you in that picture, especially with what Philly did, especially how Boston stayed the same, how the Knicks lost Isaiah Hartenstein, but added Mikal Bridges. We just didn't see that move that kept you on that tier. And I think with Brooke especially, this is the case, to a lesser extent, Pat and Bobby. But the same logic applies there as well, is if you're attaching some of the very limited assets that you have to get off of money that would allow you to use a mid-level exception or a taxpayer mid-level exception, is there a guy out there that you could get for that is going to more than upgrade what you previously had there, regardless of what you think about Pat Connaughton or Bobby Portis? Are you wasting future assets just to tread water? And I think that realistically may have been the case with what we've seen out there and what we've seen in terms of guys that have signed mid-level or taxpayer mid-levels so far this summer.
I've given Horst a lot of credit in the past for being able to find ways to make moves with limited assets. He's done that quite a few times where you're like, oh, I didn't think we'd be in the running for a PJ Tucker, or, oh, how did we get all these second round picks to trade for Jay Crowder? Whatever the case may be now. We know the Jay Crowder one did not pan out, but at the time, everyone was like, this move makes sense with the type of player that he is. So Horst, and even when he has a bad contract, he has shown like, okay, I will attach assets, get off this, and try to do something different. So he's always shown that he's willing to be active. It's not a concern when it comes to John Horst. It's just that right now, with what the Bucks have in their asset chest, there's just not much to give out right now, given the pick swaps that the Bucks are tied up in right now with two different teams. And then you look at the fact that they just have a 2031 second and 2020 or 2031 first round pick, and it's like, okay, like that's like the next asset that this Bucks team has to trade. And that's in 2031. So it's like if we are going to try to get off of a Pat Connaughton contract, for example, just using him as an example, does it make sense to give up one of the few assets that we have left just to try to make this move? Does this move give us, make us better? To your point, does it open up something else for us to do? So you have to be very diligent, because at this point, you don't have many assets to try to give out in order to get those, contracts off your books or to try to make a move happen. So like, it's no point to rush into anything just to tread water. Like you said, like the amount of assets the Bucks have right now just aren't that great.
Yeah. And that's what I've kind of come back to, is that last piece that we just mentioned of, look, we've talked about this, I think, as much as anyone. When you look at the mid-tier, the middle class in the NBA and how that's evaporated, the fact that there is a very real possibility, even if it's not with the Bucks, that Gary Trent Jr. is going to sign for the vet minimum this summer. Yeah. You mentioned Kelly Oubre earlier in the show, who signed for the vet minimum last year, that this is what it's shifted to, of guys that you would think, well, there's no way he's in our price range. It's not every one of those guys, but you're seeing more and more of those names signing for the veteran minimum, because I think there's a number of contributing factors to that. But the CBA and the way that we're seeing teams structured, it's not what it was in the past, where you would have one of those deals and you would have two guys on a max or close to it. That I think you're starting to see more of a blueprint of, we either have to have young teams that are on your rookie scale or your second max, not the full 30, 35% max. that are starting to hit their peak, or we can have one of those guys and the rest we got to be very crafty. And I also wonder, I'm not going to plant my flag and say, yes, this is the change in the guard, but do we see more of what Jalen Brunson did? Taking less money and saying, look, this is going to help us win the most. I would not advocate any player, even Bucks players, to take less money than what's out there. But look, Jalen Brunson did it. It only takes one to start to move that market. So that's another interesting piece here in this summer for the Bucks. We mentioned Gary
LeBron there. LeBron taking, he saved them, $3 million,
Ironically enough, the same amount that his son is getting paid. So, we mentioned Gary Trent Jr. And there's one other name that we learned from Shams Charania that the Bucks have shown an interest in. So it does appear, as one of the questions we had earlier in the show about that 15th roster spot, it does appear the Bucks do intend on carrying roster spot number 15. So we will get into that conversation coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Well, it's summertime now, and it gets to be that spot on the calendar. Look, we all love sports, so much so that we never want them to stop. But the playoffs have wound down, and that means we're getting fewer games. So the sports just aren't sporting like we want them to. But luckily, FanDuel keeps you in the moment with sports going whenever you want. All you have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. And if you're watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day, but constantly have to turn down the volume with all the shouting, make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day, bringing you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, and it streams 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'll get to that other name in just a second here, Camille, but look, it does appear the Bucks are at least interested in carrying a 15th on this roster because Gary Trent Jr. murmurs are not going to go away. Will Barton was the other name, so we'll get to him in just a second here, but I do think we also have to point out when we're talking about rating the off seasons here, it is worth noting, and I think it's only fair to the organization and their ownership to point out, look, this team has not tried to go cheap and duck the tax. For a team that was eliminated in the first round, 2 consecutive seasons, they're going to be $20 million into that tax in all likelihood. And I think we've gone over this at length before. If there's one move that Bucks fans will criticize, it was the PJ Tucker move. Now, granted, we heard PJ Tucker's side of the story there. We did not hear from the organization. The truth is always somewhere in the middle. But as we've seen things bear out here, you really had 1 or 2 years of a serviceable PJ Tucker from that point forward. I do think he would have helped you in the title defense here, obviously. But that's the only move you can really point to say, well, they got their championship, and now all of a sudden the purse strings are tighter and they're going cheap. Not the same story that we're seeing for a team that won the championship 2 years ago. So that's the thing that I do think we need to point out, and would be doing a disservice to the Bucks to not mention, look, it's not a team that's saying, okay, we had our run. The window may be closing. Let's figure out how we compete, but still do it where we save some money. So I do think that's an important piece to mention here. But Gary Trent Jr., we've come on here almost daily and said, I don't think it's going to happen, but I don't think you can rule it out. And a couple of shows ago, we went through the teams that actually had money, the teams that actually had taxpayer mid-levels or who had the full mid-level out there, and just went through it team by team and said, I don't really see the fit or the team that would be interested in throwing that at Gary Trent Jr. And it leaves you to this place now where maybe it's hopium, but you're starting to talk yourself into it of, you know what? This does actually really make sense. And then people will point out, hey, Gary Trent Jr., very close with Damian Lillard from their time together in Portland. And okay, you know what? We already saw Dame trying to recruit Haywood Highsmith. Maybe we're seeing the same thing here. The latest comes from Shams Charania, who mentions the Bucks are among several contenders pursuing the top free agent remaining on the market, Gary Trent Jr. So we've seen other reports that I think people have said, well, this isn't realistic, and I don't know how accurate this reporting is. But now it's coming from Shams. And I don't know about you. I know the Denver Nuggets were thrown out there as well. At this point, I would put it at about a 33% chance, somewhere around a third, that this actually happens and the Bucks end up with Gary Trent Jr.
Yeah, it's gone from like so you're telling me there's a chance this can happen, where it's kind of like, I mean, in a dream world, yeah, this can happen, to now where it's like, following how everything has shaken out for Gary Trent Jr. and hearing the reports coming out where it's like, this could happen. Like, it really could happen. 33% feels like a nice, range too. I'll probably go around 25, just trying to keep the expectations down a little bit more. I don't want to say like a third, like 1/3, but 1/4, somewhere in there. I think we have to be in the top 4 teams that he'd be considering at this point. So I hope that Dame's pitch to Gary Trent Jr. goes a bit better than with Highsmith. Jokes, because of course Miami was able to offer a lot of money to him in comparison to what the Bucks could. But what this does tell me again is, when we talked about, I think last week, about who is the starting shooting guard on this roster, last summer when we did the live Locked On Bucks with the full crew with Eric Name and Kane and Frank, the question was asked then as well, like, who is the starting shooting guard? And your response was like, I don't think he's on the roster yet. And that could be the same case of how the Bucks are seeing it this year for this team as well, because we were talking about Delon Wright. Like, yeah, if the roster stands as it currently is, I could see him being the 5th starter. But ideally, we would rather him come off the bench so that he can be that backup point guard. He can be that combo guard. He can play next to Dame, so on and so forth. So having someone else start could make that rotation just a bit easy. Of course, there are ways you can make that rotation still happen with him relieving Dame if you just have him sub out early in the first quarter. But again, it does seem like the Bucks are also like, nah, we are trying to get another shooting guard. You mentioned Will Barton as well. So like, there's something happening with the Bucks of trying to find that 2 guard. It seems like, so something to keep an eye on for sure. As soon as every time I get an alert that Shams has tweeted something or Woj just tweeted something, I'm like, is it the Gary Trent news? Like, I'm locked in. I'm trying to see where he goes. So something to definitely keep an eye on, because it seems as if the Bucks aren't necessarily like, we're good right here where we are. I'm sure they could be if things shake out that way, but they definitely seem to be trying to get that 2 guard.
Will Barton did not play in the NBA last season. I think it was Spain that he played in. Played the year before that, splitting time with the Raptors and the Wizards, but he's a career 35% 3-point shooter. I feel like Will Barton and with Gary Clark are 2 players that the Bucks have been linked to for a number of these guys, right? That we look at and we say, hey, I feel like his name, Gary Harris. Sorry, I think I said Gary Clark. I feel like those 2 names have come up quite a bit through the years for, hey, the Bucks are interested in this player. So in that sense, it makes some sense. The fact that he plays a 2 guard as well. He's 33 years old. And again, younger than Gary Trent Jr. I think that's the other massive piece. If you are able to land Gary Trent Jr. is his age. And we've talked about it before as well. This is not meant as any disrespect to Malik Beasley, but Gary Trent Jr. is a better version of Malik Beasley. He's just as good of a shooter, if for no other reason than we've seen it in the postseason from Gary Trent Jr. He can do more than just catch and shoot, as we kind of joked at times, and I know Frank and I did on a couple of post games. It was always an adventure when Malik Beasley would put the ball on the floor. And I think, again, defensively, I'm not suggesting that Gary Trent is an all defensive caliber player, but he is an upgrade defensively over Malik Beasley. So if you're able to get Gary Trent Jr. on the veterans minimum. I know we gave out a C plus, B minus in that range earlier when we said, okay, assuming the offseason is done, how would you rate it? To me, that number bumps up to probably a B if you get him for the vet minimum and you say, here are the 3 guys we got on the vet minimum, and we got young guys that maybe they're not going to contribute this year, but we really think we have something with these young guys. That makes it as much of a home run as I think you could realistically expect if you were the Bucs.
I would agree with that. I might even go a little bit higher and say like that's like a almost A minus.
Just given A minus.
Yeah, just given the resources the Bucs had to, if they are able to get Gary Trent Jr., it's like completely off of my bingo board before the offseason started of something that even in the realm of possibility for the Bucs. So like if they can find a way to get him here, I think that would really bump that up into that A minus range for me.
We didn't actually see who the other teams were that were reportedly interested in Gary Trent Jr. I know we've heard the Nuggets kicked around. I think a few people even mentioned the Lakers. I thought the Lakers roster was currently at 15 though. So my 33% logic was the Bucs, maybe a team like the Denver Nuggets, or maybe there is this kind of sleeper cell team that's under the radar that actually has we're not at that level in terms of where we think we are for competing for a championship, but we can at least pay you the taxpayer veterans or taxpayer mid-level, or even portion of the mid-level exception that we can give you. So we'll give you a little bit more money there. But yeah, I think that's the thing that all Bucs fans are kind of locked into and focused on now. As you mentioned, whenever you see the tweet from Shams or Woj of, is this Gary Trent Jr.? I think that's where we're going to be for the next, who knows, until Gary Trent Jr. Actually signs on with a team. We didn't mention much about Will Barton other than played overseas a season ago. Is a 12-year pro, I believe. Mentioned the career 35% 3-point shooter that he is. And look, it would just be more depth at the 2 guard. I think it would be obviously not quite the shooter as Malik Beasley, but in terms of your expectations and what you can get from him, a Malik Beasley level signing, if that's who the Bucs would end up adding.
Yeah, and if that's the case too, I do wonder if maybe it is Wright that starts and then Barton's the bench guy off of that.
Yeah.
Just trying
I would not expect Barton to be your starter.
Yeah, because that doesn't, but it does alleviate the concern that we had about like, well, who's that other guard coming off of your bench? It would be Barton, not someone I would be necessarily thrilled about, but like just more depth, as you said.
And this is kind of what we're talking about. You look at some of the names. You know, we mentioned Gary Trent Jr., Tyus Jones still out there, even Markelle Fultz. All these names that you thought at the very least would have a home by now, and probably more than the veteran minimum, and they're still free agents. And again, we'll probably devote a show to the CBA, see if Frank wants to hop on at some point later in the summer. I still can't help but think the Paul George signing with the Sixers just imploded a lot of people's plans, even though there was, those murmurs and rumors and reports of it for a while now, dating all the way back to during the season when you said, hey, Philly's angling to sign Paul George and they're going to have money. I still think we all anticipated he would stay in Los Angeles with the Clippers. And the fact that the team that had the most, or one of the 3 teams that had the most money to sign Paul George, I think that changed plans for a lot of teams and a lot of players that are out there. Last chance to get in your mailbag questions, as we're going to address those in a couple of days here. A little bit later in the week, we'll do a mailbag show. We are also going to do a show taking a look at some of the moves under John Horst. And if there's one move that didn't really work out that you could take back, which one would that be? We put together a list of those moves that I think would make the most sense to examine. So we'll do that a little bit later in the week. And tomorrow we're going to do another live show recapping late night Bucks basketball. Is there a summer league game number 3 is a 9:00 tip this evening tonight out in Vegas. So we're going to do a live show tomorrow morning recapping game number 3 for the Bucks. All this time is just kind of blending together and it's all a blur now of late. Camille, we have the RNC going on literally like 2 or 3 blocks away from where I currently am. So if I can't walk there, I probably can't go there. But at least we got Bucks basketball tonight, and college football came out yesterday. So
enough to keep you in the house and satisfied.
Right. So again, a lot to look forward to this week, the post-game show and the moves of John Horst and your mailbag questions that we'll get to later in the week. Hopefully we're adding a bonus show as well to break down the signing of Gary Trent Jr. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.